What if I told you that one quiet decision, one that felt safe, even responsible at the time, slowly erased my happiness over the course of an entire lifetime? I am 96 years old now. I have outlived my friends, my husband, even some of my own regrets. But not this one. This one stayed. It followed me through every decade, every milestone, every quiet night when the world slowed down enough for truth to speak. And the truth is simple. I chose comfort over truth. It didn't feel like a mistake when I made it. That's the dangerous part. Most life-altering decisions don't arrive with warning signs or dramatic consequences. They come disguised as practicality, as stability, as something that just makes sense. Day, yes, days as A's. I was 23 when I made that choice. There was a man I loved. Not the kind of love you read about in books. No, it was quieter than that, but it was real. When he spoke, I felt understood. When he looked at me, I felt seen. And when I imagined a future, it was always with him in it. But he was not the right choice. He didn't have money. He didn't have status. My family didn't approve. They said love fades, but security remains. They said I needed to think about my future, about stability, about what kind of life I wanted to build. And so I made the smart decision. I married someone else, a good man, a respectable man. A man who could provide a comfortable life. There were no arguments, no chaos, no uncertainty. Everything was predictable. Everything was fine. But that was the beginning of it, not the pain, not the regret, the quiet disappearance of joy. At first, I told myself this is what adulthood feels like. That happiness is something you sacrifice for stability. That excitement is for the young, and peace is for the wise. But what I didn't realize was this: there is a difference between peace and emptiness. Years passed, then decades. We built a life together. Children, a home, routines that repeated so often they became invisible. From the outside, it looked like success. It looked like I had done everything right. But inside, something was slowly fading. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a little, every year. And by the time I understood what I had lost, it was too late to go back. That is the danger of one choice. It doesn't destroy your happiness in a moment. It does it quietly, patiently, until one day you wake up at 96. Accept your own heart. The strangest part about losing your happiness is this: you don't notice it happening. There is no single moment where everything collapses, no loud breaking point, no clear line you can point to and say, this is where I went wrong. Instead, life feels as though it is simply unfolding the way it is supposed to, orderly and acceptable, even admirable from the outside. That's how it was for me. After I married my husband, everything moved forward with a kind of quiet efficiency. We settled into routines almost immediately. He was kind in the way responsible people are kind. He made sure the bills were paid, the house was maintained, and the future was planned. There was no instability, no chaos, no unpredictability. My parents were relieved. My friends said I was lucky, and slowly I began to believe them. In the beginning, I told myself that love would grow, that it wasn't something you needed to begin with, but something that could be built over time through shared responsibility and mutual respect. I convinced myself that what I had once felt, the connection with the man I didn't choose, was simply a phase, something emotional and impractical, something that belonged to youth rather than adulthood. So I buried it, not dramatically and not with pain, but quietly, almost invisibly. And that is how the most important parts of ourselves disappear, not through force, but through neglect. Days turned into months, and months into years. I learned how to be a good wife, how to anticipate needs, how to maintain peace, how to avoid unnecessary tension. I adjusted myself slowly, trimming away pieces of who I was to better fit the life I had chosen. At the time, it felt like maturity, like growth, like becoming the kind of woman the world respects. Only much later would I understand that what I was really doing was abandoning parts of myself in exchange for approval and stability. When we had children, they became the center of my world, and for a while, they filled something inside me that had been quietly empty. Their laughter echoed through the house. Their needs gave me purpose, and their presence distracted me from the questions I had long refused to answer. I do not regret those years, not even for a moment. But even in that fullness, there were small, almost imperceptible moments when something deeper surfaced. I would be washing dishes late at night, folding clothes in a quiet room, or sitting by the window after everyone had gone to sleep, and a feeling would rise within me. Not a clear thought, not a memory, but a subtle question that never fully formed. Is this all there is? And just as quickly as it appeared, I would push it away because I had responsibilities, because I had made my choice, because questioning it felt both pointless and dangerous. That is how one decision becomes a pattern. You do not make it once. You remake it every single day. Every time I ignored that quiet voice inside me, I reinforced the life I had built. Every time I chose silence over honesty, I moved one step further away from myself, and the world rewarded me for it. People admired my stability, my consistency, my ability to maintain a life without disruption. I became the example others pointed to, the woman who had done everything right, who had chosen wisely, who had built something solid and respectable. But what no one ever sees is the cost of doing everything right for the wrong reasons. My husband and I lived side by side, but not truly together. We shared responsibilities, schedules, and expectations, but not depth. Conversations remained on the surface. Emotions were managed rather than explored, and vulnerability never found a place to exist between us. Over time, I stopped trying to create that connection because something inside me already knew it had never been there to begin with. That is another quiet danger. When something feels slightly wrong in the beginning, you believe you can fix it later, but later rarely arrives. Instead, you adapt, you adjust, and you slowly lower your expectations until what once felt lacking begins to feel normal. Years passed like this, marked by celebrations that looked perfect from the outside. Anniversaries, birthdays, holidays filled with carefully arranged smiles and photographs that told a story of happiness. But photographs cannot capture absence. They cannot show the lack of excitement when you see the person you are supposed to love, the silence where meaningful conversation should exist, or the slow realization that you have become disconnected from your own desires. I remember one evening in particular, when I was in my early 40s. The children were asleep, my husband had gone to bed, and the house was completely still. I sat alone in the living room, and without any clear reason, I began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, steady stream of tears that seemed to come from somewhere deep within me. Nothing had gone wrong that day. In fact, everything had gone exactly as it always did. And yet, in that silence, something inside me spoke more clearly than it ever had before. You are not happy. I didn't say it out loud, and I didn't fully allow myself to think it, but I felt it with undeniable clarity. And then, just as I had done for years, I buried it again. Because what was the alternative? To admit that I had made the wrong choice, to disrupt the life I had spent decades building, to hurt the people who depended on me? No, that was not a path I allowed myself to consider. So I did what I had always done. I chose comfort over truth, again and again, reinforcing the very pattern that had led me here. This is how a single decision evolves into a lifelong cycle of self-betrayal. It is not the original choice that destroys your happiness. It is the thousands of smaller choices that follow, the moments when you could speak but choose silence, when you could change but choose safety, when your inner voice asks for honesty and you refuse to listen. Over time, something inside you begins to learn a dangerous lesson, that your truth does not matter. And once that belief takes root, everything else begins to fade. I stopped asking myself what I wanted, stopped imagining different possibilities, stopped listening to the part of me that once felt alive and curious and hopeful. I became functional, reliable, predictable, the kind of person the world finds easy to understand and depend on. But functionality is not fulfillment, and I did not understand that distinction until much later. By the time my children had grown and left the house, the silence became impossible to ignore. Without their presence, there was nothing left to distract me from the reality I had spent years avoiding. It was just me and the life I had built, and for the first time, I had to sit with it fully, not for a moment or a single evening, but every day. That is when the weight of my choice revealed itself completely, not as a dramatic regret, but as a deep and persistent emptiness that could no longer be ignored. And still, I did not change, because by then I no longer believed that I could. That is the final stage of a life shaped by the wrong choice. You do not just lose your happiness, you lose the belief that you deserve it. And once that belief is gone, you stop searching for a way back. There is something even more dangerous than making the wrong choice. It is living long enough to fully understand it and still believing you cannot change. By the time I reached my 50s, my life had become so structured, so predictable, that it no longer felt like something I was actively living. It felt like something I was maintaining. Every day followed a familiar pattern. Wake up, complete responsibilities, manage the household, speak when necessary, remain silent when appropriate, and move gently through a life that no longer required me to feel deeply, only to function efficiently. And the world continued to reward me for it. People described me as strong, composed, dependable. They admired my ability to hold everything together. What they didn't understand was that holding everything together had required me to slowly come apart inside. That is the hidden cost of choosing comfort over truth. You don't just lose excitement, you lose aliveness. I remember a moment that should have been insignificant, but somehow changed the way I saw everything. I was sitting at a small cafe, waiting for a friend who never arrived. It was one of those quiet afternoons where time seems to stretch. At the table next to me sat an older couple, perhaps in their 60s. They weren't doing anything extraordinary. They were simply talking, but the way they spoke to each other, it was different. There was curiosity in their voices, warmth, a kind of presence that made everything around them feel softer. At one point, the woman reached across the table and touched the man's hand, not out of habit, but out of something real. And I felt something tighten in my chest, not jealousy. Recognition. That was the moment I understood what had been missing all along. Not stability, not security, not even love in the traditional sense, but connection. The kind of connection that makes you feel awake inside your own life. And as I sat there, watching them, a thought came to me, clearer than anything I had allowed myself to think in years. You chose a life where this would never exist. That realization didn't break me. It clarified me. For the first time, I stopped telling myself the comforting story that everything had turned out the way it was supposed to. I stopped pretending that what I felt was enough. I saw my life without decoration, without justification, without the soft language I had used for decades to make it easier to accept. And what I saw was this: my vibe built on avoidance, avoidance of discomfort, avoidance of conflict, avoidance of truth. That one choice I made at 23, it wasn't just about who I married. It was about the standard I set for my entire life. I taught myself that safety mattered more than authenticity, that approval mattered more than alignment, that it was better to be accepted for a version of myself that wasn't real than to risk rejection for who I truly was. And once you learn that lesson, it doesn't stay in one area of your life. It spreads. I began to see how that same pattern had shaped everything. The way I spoke carefully instead of honestly, the way I avoided difficult conversations, the way I stayed in situations longer than I should have because leaving felt too disruptive, the way I ignored opportunities that required courage, choosing instead what was familiar, what was predictable, what was safe. It wasn't just one choice anymore. It was an identity built around not losing rather than truly living. And the cost of that identity is invisible at first, because nothing dramatic happens. You don't fail. You don't collapse. You don't lose everything. You simply never fully experience anything. That is a different kind of loss, a quieter one, but in many ways a deeper one. By the time I reached my 60s, my husband and I had settled into something that looked like companionship, but felt more like coexistence. We were polite, respectful, efficient, but there was no emotional intimacy, no sense of discovery, no feeling that the person sitting across from me truly knew me, or that I had ever allowed myself to be known. And the truth is, I cannot place all of that on him, because I was the one who chose not to reveal myself. I was the one who decided long ago that it was safer to be agreeable than to be real. That realization was difficult to accept, because it meant that my unhappiness was not just the result of one decision, but the result of a pattern I had actively maintained. And yet, even with that awareness, I still didn't change. That is the part most people don't understand. They believe that once you see the truth, you will naturally act on it. But awareness and action are not the same. By that point in my life, the idea of change felt overwhelming. Where would I even begin? How do you rewrite decades of behavior? How do you suddenly become someone who speaks honestly, who takes risks, who prioritizes truth when you have spent your entire life doing the opposite? So I did what many people do. I told myself it was too late to change, too late to start over. Too late to become someone different. And that belief, more than anything else, is what kept me trapped, because it gave me permission to stay exactly where I was. Years continued to pass. My children built their own lives. My responsibilities became fewer. The structure that had once defined my days began to dissolve, leaving behind something I was not prepared for: silence. Not just the silence of a quiet house, but the silence of a life without distraction. And in that silence, everything I had avoided became impossible to ignore. Memories returned, not just of the man I didn't choose, but of the person I used to be before I made that choice. The version of me who felt things deeply, who was curious, who was willing to risk discomfort for something meaningful. I began to realize that I didn't just lose a relationship, I lost myself. And that is the true consequence of choosing comfort over truth. You don't just create a life that lacks depth. You become a person who no longer knows how to seek it. I would sit for hours, sometimes doing nothing, just thinking, replaying moments, not in a dramatic or painful way, but with a kind of quiet clarity that only comes with age. I could see the patterns now, the cause and effect, the way one decision had influenced another and another, until an entire life had been shaped by that initial compromise. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided for decades. What would my life have been like if I had chosen differently? Not a life without difficulty, not a life without pain, but a life with truth, a life where I felt aligned with myself, even when things were uncertain, a life where I allowed connection, even if it came with risk, a life where I didn't silence my own voice in order to be accepted by others. I will never know the answer to that question, but I know this. It would have been a life I recognized, and that is what I lost. Not perfection, not success, but recognition, the ability to look at my own life and say, this feels like mine. Instead, I lived a life that made sense, a life that was approved, a life that was stable, but not a life that was truly lived. And the hardest part is not the regret itself, it is the clarity. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand how it happened, you cannot pretend it didn't. And once you realize that it all began with one quiet choice, and you begin to wonder how many people around you are doing the same thing right now. They start convincing themselves that safety is enough, that comfort is enough, that fine is enough, not realizing that one day they too will sit in the silence of their own life, and feel what I feel now. Not dramatic pain, not overwhelming sorrow, but something far more difficult to explain. The quiet, undeniable awareness, say, that they traded their truth for a life that never truly belonged to them. If you have listened to my story this far, then I will not comfort you with soft words. I will not tell you that everything happens for a reason, or that every path leads to where you are meant to be. At 96, I have learned something far less comforting, but far more useful. Some choices do not correct themselves. Some paths, once taken, do not gently guide you back to where you belong. They simply continue, quietly and consistently, shaping who you become until one day you realize you have arrived somewhere you never truly chose. That is what happened to me. It was never just about marrying the wrong person. It was about the moment I decided that my inner voice was less important than external approval. It was about the moment I chose to ignore what felt true in exchange for what looked right. And from that moment on, my life followed a pattern that I repeated without even realizing it. So if there is anything I want you to understand, it is this. The most dangerous decision you will ever make is not the loud, reckless one. It is the quiet, reasonable one that asks you to betray yourself just a little, because just a little is never just once. It becomes a habit, then a pattern, then a life. You tell yourself it's not the right time. You tell yourself you will choose differently later. You tell yourself that stability is more important, that avoiding discomfort is wise, that keeping the peace is maturity. And slowly, without noticing, you begin to build a life that no longer includes you. And here is the truth that took me decades to accept. Happiness is not built on what is safe. It is built on what is true. truth is not always comfortable. It does not guarantee ease. In fact, it often brings uncertainty, conflict, and risk. But it also brings something that comfort never can: alignment, the feeling that your life, with all its imperfections, still belongs to you. I did not lose my happiness in a single moment. I lost it in the 1,000 small moments where I chose not to listen to myself. And by the time I understood that, I had spent a lifetime becoming someone I barely recognized. But you are not 96. You are here, now, still in the middle of your choices. So ask yourself, honestly, where in your life are you choosing comfort over truth? Where are you saying yes when something inside you is quietly saying no? Where are you staying silent when your voice is asking to be heard? Do not ignore those questions, because one day, if you do, they will return to you, not as questions, but as answers. And those answers will not come with urgency or panic. They will come quietly, in the stillness, in the moments when there is nothing left to distract you. And you will see your life clearly, not as it appeared to others, but as it truly was. I cannot change the choice I made, but you still can.